I must say that I'm really, really happy that this course is starting, because when Michael Jacobs and I edited the book, which is basically the textbook for the course, we very much had students in mind. The questions about why economics has it failed, what sort of new types of curriculums might we need, are fundamentally then linked with what's actually happening in the economy. And so the way we actually opened up the book was with this wonderful question that the Queen asked. It's very funny to see what Philip is doing there. He's obviously dozing off, thinking economics really is the dismal science. But after the financial crisis, which wiped globally more than 3% of GDP, so global output fell by over 3% in 1 year, she was kind of like, guys, what happened? You know, you're economists. If you were a physicist, you know, you should understand how gravity works. Why did you economists completely kind of not foresee this massive crash? And it was a really good question, because in theory, if you're looking at something, you should, you know, also sort of foresee a big crisis that might be occurring. Now, one thing is that we should remember that economics is a social science. It's not a natural science. It's very interesting, actually, to look at the history of economic theory and how it incorporated different types of tools, increasingly from the natural sciences, almost out of a sense of insecurity, wanting to show that it was more scientific than, say, sociology and anthropology. And this is quite important, because when we're thinking about, you know, the degree to which economics has to rethink itself as a discipline, and how fundamentally then linked the discipline itself, its ability to think about the world, to throw tools at different sort of questions that it might be looking at, like development, labor markets, stuff that I look a lot at, innovation and industrial policy. The tools that actually one is using to look at the facts, the data, are not, you know, just, if you want, objective. It depends on how you are applying those tools. Even, I'm sure you know, how you draw a graph can actually portray data in different ways. And I think that there's this real opportunity now that when, you know, again, the Queen asked this fundamental question, why did you economists not sort of foresee this, that we actually use this as an opportunity to really kind of relook at all the tools. And by that I mean also what kind of statistics, what kind of mathematics. And there is this whole movement actually around the world called Rethinking Economics. There's a group in Manchester, a group in SOAS, a group in different universities. And I feel that sometimes some of the blame on economics has been a bit simplistic. So for example, there's too much math, right? You know, there's been too much modeling, and we need more case studies, and we need to make it more user-friendly. When in fact, if one starts asking, you know, do we actually have the wrong toolkit, that would actually require a different set of questions, including what kind of math are we actually using? And as I was saying, when economics did undergo about 100 years ago this kind of attempt to show it was more scientific, it increasingly took math from Newtonian physics. And there was, you know, different types of math it could have also taken, say, from biology. And so this notion, you know, trying to portray the capitalist system, the economic system, as one that has equilibria, unique equilibria, centers of gravity, where averages actually matter, would be a way of, if you want, telling a story about the economy that would in fact lend itself to the math that one can borrow from Newtonian physics. Whereas if perhaps it's a system that is constantly subject to crises, whether it's big economic crises or specifically financial crises, if it has different types of paths, so multiple equilibria, not just unique equilibria, if you have things like innovation, which are causing constant differences between economic actors, say firms, right? So this process of heterogeneity and differentiation, then one would have to make sure that the body of math that one has, for example, could actually deal with those processes. So distance from mean events, and again, disequilibrium forces. And I'm just saying that, there's even not much on this, to be honest, in the textbook. And I'm just saying that just because we should be wary of sort of easy critiques of the field, especially in an era where we really should be rethinking the toolkit. And I think it's actually a really exciting time to be teaching also this course, which is very much of a team effort, and it's very much linked to what we're trying to do in the Institute, because after the crisis, that occurred, or between 2007 and 2008, there was really a very, explicit recognition globally that the problem should not be just to try to get growth, economic growth, but to really rethink what kind of growth we have. There was actually plenty of growth that led to the financial crisis. Today, there is actually a bit of growth in this country, but it is a particular type of growth. In the UK, most growth that is occurring is actually occurring through consumption. So people actually buying things, often with income they don't have, so having to take out credit, debt, so that the ratio of private debt to disposable income, so how much money people actually have, and the debt that they're taking out with credit cards or other mechanisms, that ratio, debt to private income, is actually back to levels close to what it was just before the financial crisis hit. And that was, as you'll learn in some of the classes coming up, one of the key causes of the crisis, right? So how an economy grows, whether it's through investment, business investment, government investment, whether that investment takes on a particular type of direction, sort of fueling a new big technological wave, whether it's green innovation or other types of innovation, that matters. And we're going to be looking a lot at that. But this is an exciting time because, it's quite rare, actually, in terms of human history, that so many different countries have actually signed up to things like the Sustainable Development Goals. There's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. They all have to do with kind of really important challenges around hunger, around inequality, climate change, cleaning the ocean, getting the plastic out. And so really thinking through how can we align our way of constructing economies with also tackling these huge societal challenges that we have is really important, but it has to be done with particular types of tools and toolkits. And so what this class will try to do, this course will try to do, is really kind of help you understand both why it is that maybe we have some problems with the current tools. Sometimes these are ideological problems where we actually kind of find it perhaps quite useful to pretend that the economy is working in a particular way in order for some to capture some of the gains from that story. In the previous book that I just wrote, The Value of Everything, I begin with Plato's wonderful quote that storytellers rule the world. So if economics is a social science, we should be quite careful to sometimes also think that some of these things that are presented to us as theories, sometimes they're actually just stories, and we might want to unpick them. I'll mention something about this later when I talk about corporate governance. So the way that certain companies are set up to maximize shareholder value, that's not some sort of hardcore scientific theory. That's sort of a story that has been told about perhaps why it's good to organize a company in that way. And it's really important that we are able to contest and debate those different stories, whether it's about corporate governance or different theories of why some economies grow more than other ones. And one of the key things that we tried to do in this first chapter of the book with Michael Jacobs, who I co-edited this textbook with, was really also to kind of debunk the first big story, which is what is the role of government. So given that there's actually lots of problems in the economy, and I'll mention some of these problems in a minute, which have to do with inequality, with something that I'll call financialization. If we want to tackle these problems, including climate change, there's different ways that one could actually go about it. One could sort of see the role of policy as just coming in afterwards. They have to wait till there's some sort of big mess up in the system, what economists call market failures, and you fix that market failure. Or you could actually have a much more active role in terms of seeing the role of policy alongside business and alongside other types of organizations. Increasingly, these are like third sector philanthropic organizations to actively co-create and co-shape markets. And this is kind of the position that we take in the chapter, is that this kind of old style thinking about what the role of the state is or policy is in economics is just too lame. It's just too boring given these big challenges that we have ahead. Whether those challenges be the financial crisis, which we haven't really tackled if, again, you look at some of the statistics that I mentioned, or, again, climate change or inequality. This notion that you're just fixing a market failure and hence the policymaker is kind of setting the rules of the game, fixing the failures, whether they be market or system failures, and then in the process kind of de-risking who? The risk takers in business, enabling, facilitating, setting some sort of background framework conditions. this is kind of a very strong discourse and vocabulary of what the policy-making process is, right? So if you have de-riskers here and risk-takers there, or those who are facilitating there and those who are taking on the difficulties here. Part of what we want to do is to really, again, debunk some of the underlying assumptions in this language that is everywhere. I mean, I work with policymakers all over the world, and this language of facilitating, enabling, fixing market failures is a very strong one. And let me just say something about this approach, because I'm not sure if there's a chapter actually that deals with it explicitly enough, but basically within economics, as I mentioned, there's this notion that the role of policy is to fix a market failure, and the failures can come about for different reasons. And this is a very useful framework, actually. So let me just go through some of these examples. So if you have a public good, okay, meaning a good where the production of it creates all these positive externalities across the economy, so it's very hard for any individual company to, say, appropriate the profits from it just for itself, like basic research. When the government funds basic research, whether it's nuclear fusion or high blue sky science and chemistry, once that knowledge appears, it's hard for one company to say, oh, it's mine, right? So you get underinvestment in areas that have strong positive externalities, in other words, where there's these strong spillovers across the whole economy. So the government has to come in and fund that. So there's, government all over the world fund things like basic research. Or, clean air. If there's clean air, we're all benefiting. So there will be underinvestment because there will be a free riding problem because some will think, oh, someone else will produce it. Or national defense. The opposite, negative externalities instead of positive externalities. If you have the production of something that is negative but is not actually being calculated in your cost structure, say like pollution, right? Or if a company is polluting but is not being penalized for doing it, it's not even in its cost, then the government has to come in and make sure to correct that market failure by installing something like a carbon tax so that the company actually gets penalized for having polluted, right? Information failures, if you have asymmetry, so for example, if a small company wants to produce a new gadget or set up a new company, but it doesn't have any existing assets, it might not actually get a loan from a bank. So you have an asymmetry of information between the bank and the company. The bank doesn't know if this is going to be just a crappy little company that wants to do something great but then just fails. So you have an asymmetric information problem, and so you might need the government to come in and help small, medium enterprises grow. So one of the things we do in the book is not to say that these failures don't exist. These are actually quite useful mechanisms to think incrementally about why you might need government action in different places. What we argue is that actually the big transformational shifts, including how to actually get, for example, the financial sector to be better linked with the real economy, as opposed to just financing different parts of the financial sector. So how to have a productive financial sector, which is really kind of fueling the wheels of commerce as opposed to just fueling a debt-driven system. How to really get different types of businesses to be concerned about climate change and actually see climate change as an opportunity for investment. How to get new types of consumption patterns that are more amenable if you want to a green transition. How to better align even the work, say, of Josh, the central banking system with the kind of growth that perhaps we want in the real economy. It's really hard to just think of it as just fixing little bits here and there. And this is why we argue in this first chapter that we need sort of a different lens. We need a lens that really sees the government and all its different organizations, business of all different types, small, medium, and large, third sector organizations and civil society organizations, including trade unions, as together, if you want, co-creating and co-shaping markets. And here we borrow from some really interesting thinking from someone called Karl Polanyi, who wrote this fantastic book in 1944 called The Great Transformation, where he was very explicit. He said, we got to understand what markets are. There's this word, the market, that everyone uses, but there's different types of markets. And the capitalist market, he said, is first of all very recent. It only really came about 250, 300 years ago. The long distance kind of trade, international trade, that's existed for a long time. Local markets where you kind of buy fruit and vegetables at the corner store, they've existed for a long time. But the capitalist market, which is like the national market where you actually have a sense of some sort of average price of a kilo of oranges, is recent, and it was actually forced into existence by different types of regulations and policymaking. And so if that's the case, if the market itself, in terms of how we think about it, was actually almost a construct that was forced into existence, then the word that we often use in terms of intervention or regulation in the market itself should be rethought. Because it's not as if you have the market here, and then you're simply intervening in it or regulating it. How you regulate, how you intervene, how a public sector decides to invest or not to invest, how businesses are organized, if they're maximizing shareholder value or something else, how public and private are interacting, how trade unions are interacting in that process, all these different forces are actually forming the kind of markets we get. So markets are fundamentally outcomes of that process. And I know this sounds a bit abstract, but it's really important because otherwise how many times have you just heard people say the market forces, as though they're like out there, kind of deterministic market forces? If you understand markets as outcomes of the interactions between public, private, third sector, the kind of questions you then ask are completely different. How should we organize these organizations? Does governance matter? Does the relationships, the partnerships between the organizations matter? When I often speak to my biologist friends, they say, why do you use this word, ecosystem, so often? As economists love to say, or at least policymakers, the kind of innovation ecosystem. They say, what kind of ecosystem? Is it parasitic? Is it symbiotic? Is it mutualistic? And so how we structure the relationships between companies, between different types of state actors, between trade unions, will fundamentally define the kind of partnership and ecosystem we have. And John Maynard Keynes, who you surely have heard of, his house was nearby here in Bloomsbury, also, I think, said something very nice, which is that the whole point then of policymaking and government is actually kind of to dream up the big things that are really not being done. They're really doing what the private sector is not doing, and that's not just, he didn't put it this way, but this is how I interpret it. It's not just tinkering here and there, it's really doing the things which at present are not being done, and understanding those things as also visions and what we'll call later missions of how you might transform an economy is very different from waiting for different parts of the economy to fail and then to come in and bandage it up. So the book here is called Rethinking Capitalism, and there's, this is very important for us to really sort of unpick those words as I just did with the market, as not sort of taking for granted that we all understand what these words mean. So capitalism itself is important to unpick. As I mentioned before, I said it's quite a recent system. There is different modes of production using sort of Marxist terminology before modern capitalism, so feudalism existed for 500 years. And it's quite interesting if we ask ourselves, well, what then defines capitalism as a system of production versus the systems that came before it or any sort of system that might come after it. And this is something I think that you'll be thinking about throughout the course, but just to say there's different types of capitalism. There's some really interesting work done by Hall and Soskis. I think Soskis was at LSE, can't remember. And I think this work is very important because, in fact, if you break down the advanced economies, so in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe, in the US, in Latin America, in China today, there's actually different ways that capitalism itself is unfolding. And in fact, that literature itself, if you're interested in it as sort of a supplementary reading, I think actually kind of missed out some fundamental aspects of some of these countries. So this notion that some countries have sort of very little state involvement, so a liberal market economy, versus countries that have a lot of state involvement. So sort of, Cuba, China, former Eastern European countries which weren't usually fully communist, but sometimes had some market, some communist characteristics, and some level, something in between, sort of coordinated market economies. This looks like a nice and neat division, but actually the US, for example, the United States of America, often presents itself as, a country that really believes in the free market and is much less, if you want, state-driven than an area like Scandinavia. But actually for some things, like innovation, in terms of what actually happened to allow a region like Silicon Valley to come about, there was huge amounts of state investment. That's what my book, The Entrepreneurial State, was about the massive amounts of state investments that basically went into everything that is in your iPhone today. You know, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, these are all technologies that make your smart products smart. They were actually funded by the state. So in the US, what's been interesting is they've had this kind of dual system that for the welfare state, so in terms of the provision of health care, and workers' compensation, and different aspects of the welfare system, like education, which in some countries is completely free. Actually, the primary and secondary education in the US is free. Well, anyway, a public education system exists. Some aspects of the welfare system have been very much hands-off by the state, but other aspects of the US system, like the innovation system, lots of hands-on. And so this whole point that actually capitalism is fundamentally a system based on institutions, organizations, power relationships, understanding the relationship between, again, capital and labor. This is very important, and you will be looking throughout the course at also how these relationships have changed over time. I think class by Bill Azanik in particular will look at some of the capital-labor issues. So one of the things that this first chapter does in the book is to kind of just point to, you know, kind of 5 massive problems that we currently face. And it's precisely these problems that the chapter says, well, guess what? You're not going to sort of fix your way out of this. You really have to kind of understand fundamentally why these problems exist. So, for example, the current problems we have around finance and how the financial sector has evolved, that will you will have a different lens in terms of the solution if you think that money is just a medium of exchange versus understanding capitalism is fundamentally a system that's actually based on debt, a debt-driven system. This is something that Stephanie Kelton will talk about next week. But anyway, so, you know, increasing inequality in many countries, especially within different categories, stagnant productivity, so output per labor, you know, not growing because of, again, I'm not going to go into the reasons why, I'm just going to kind of list them off quickly now. Stagnant productivity in different sectors, so not enough output per labor. Why? Again, we'll be looking into that. Increasing financialization in terms of the size of the financial sector, broadly defined relative to the rest of the economy, as well as the degree to which companies themselves have been following in the real economy, so in industry, more of a financial logic rather than a logic about increasing long-run growth. Vulnerability of the system, increasing vulnerability of the system to banking crises and financial crises, and one of the biggest problems of all time, because we'd all like to have a planet to live in, climate change. And you might have seen the IPCC report, which came out a month ago, basically arguing that we just have 12 years left to solve this problem if we're going to have a planet. So what the first chapter does is kind of just which I think you were assigned. Well, have people already read it? No, because they've just, yeah, in theory? Okay. Let me just get my one. Good. Okay. So kind of just lists a lot of these problems with the whole point of the course then is going to be to look at different interpretations of why these problems exist. You could look at inequality with different lenses. But let's just look quickly at some of these trends. Basically, the problem of inequality, there's different types of inequality, but one of the fundamental ones is that basically from up until the mid-1970s, when productivity increased, wages sort of followed suit. So you had, you know, trade unions, for example, that made it one of their main ambitions to actually negotiate higher wages to actually be matching, or sometimes even matching, increasing even faster than productivity, but basically the two rising together. And from the early 80s, mid 80s, and definitely from the 90s onwards, the two curves start to depart. So rises in productivity not being matched by rises in wages. And GDP itself, which can be broken down into different ways in terms of both the products that are produced in the economy, all the goods and services, but also the generation of income from that production of goods and services, can be broken down into different types of income like profits, interest, and wages. And the wage share today of GDP, so say the profits over wages of GDP today, is very high, precisely because wages have been stagnating. And this is not unrelated to that data point that I mentioned before of private debt being so high. So if your wages are not increasing, and these are average numbers, this one here for 36 developed economies at an aggregate level, If wages are not rising, if real incomes are not rising, then just to retain your existing living standards, you will need to take out debt. So this very high level of debt that characterized the financial crisis was not unrelated to the fact that real incomes weren't rising. This is very important, by the way, because if you read lots of the media at the time of the crisis, there was almost like a blame, like all these irresponsible people taking out all this debt and taking out these mortgages they couldn't afford. Well, yeah, you could personalize the blame in that way, but if you then look at what was actually happening with real income, in many cases that debt had to be taken on, and the sector itself grew very much, benefiting parasitically from them. There's also, as I'm sure you've heard, this whole problem about the 99% and the 1% in terms of how you can actually divide income groups by percentiles, and you really see across the world, this is the data from Piketty and his team, who wrote that great book called Capital, 21st Century Capitalism, on inequality. You really see the share that the 1% have, if you want, captured from wealth has increased over time in most developed countries. And the ratio in average disposable income for the top 10% compared with the bottom 10%. This is for the whole OECD in 2013. You also see that it's quite different between countries, the US being one of the most unequal with this statistic. And if you then unpick why that is, of course, there's different factors one could look at, right? I mean, I already mentioned one. So the power of trade unions, which are basically those organizations which have historically been, if you want, responsible for making sure that wages were, in fact, rising along with productivity, but also getting better work conditions. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that trade unions got us all sorts of things, including weekends, 8-hour workdays. I always think that someone should do a movie called The Union, just to remind lots of people that so many basic rights we have were actually fought for. But also those jobs that are unionized, the difference between modern advanced manufacturing and old manufacturing jobs, the service economy. Different countries will have a different balance between those. But also, again, capital-labor relationships, even regardless of whether you have trade unions or not, will be very different in different countries. So I mentioned before maximizing shareholder value. That could be one particular way that a company sees the way that it owes its how do you say, that it can be organized. Another concept in Scandinavian countries that is often talked about is maximizing stakeholder value, not shareholder value. So you might have workers actually on the board of companies themselves. And so that will obviously affect the way that the value that's created in the private sector is distributed. And as I mentioned, this issue of financialization is quite interesting because you can break it down into kind of three different dimensions. One is, as I said, the size of the financial sector itself has absolutely grown over time through different types of factors. One being the deregulation of the sector, which again, there's a whole chapter discussing that in the book. But also, if people are requiring to take out more debt because of stagnant incomes, that also, if you want, fuels it. And you can see here, this is data from Andy Haldane, who is the chief economist at the Bank of England. He looks here at the growth of financial intermediation, which is basically the entire financial sector. Think of it not just as banks, but also mortgages, real estate, the entire kind of different types of sectors that you would categorize broadly under finance. So the degree to which financial intermediation has grown as a percentage of gross value added compared to the rest of the economy, which is basically everything else except agriculture and finance, so all the sort of manufacturing and services. And what he argues is that the reason that this occurred, this kind of explosion of finance, is that finance basically was lending to different parts of the financial sector called FIRE. It's very adequately called FIRE, so finance, insurance, and real estate. And in fact, Josh's work has looked a lot at how that's then created asset bubbles and housing crises and housing bubbles if so much money is poured into, say, real estate in terms of betting on that sector, on the assets in the real estate industry rising when actually, as we know, they can fall quickly as they are today with Brexit in this country. But anyway, so one side of the finance problem is this, which is the relative size of the sector outpacing the rest of the real economy and actually being quite unlinked with it. You might remember that there's some banks in the old days, like Chemical Bank was actually called Chemical Bank because its main role was fueling the chemical sector. So that's not necessarily good or bad, but it just shows just how linked up the idea of finance was with what was actually happening in the real economy and industry. So chemical banks' role was initially at least to really fuel the growth of that sector. So this kind of finance problem seen from this side of financialization is when you have this kind of delinkage, when finance is just financing itself. And this, of course, part of this also then makes the system much more vulnerable to banking crises, because all the different parts of the financial system become fundamentally interlinked with other parts of the financial system. So one brick falls and the whole thing sort of comes tumbling down. And there's quite a bit of work in the book by Randy Ray and his co-author on looking at this in much more detail. But the other side of financialization is actually what's happening in industry. So in companies, in the IT sector, in the energy sector, in the pharmaceutical sector, right? So when I use the word real economy, I mean companies in industry as opposed to in finance. And here, this is the other kind of mirror image of the problem, which is when companies start to just be obsessed, if you want, with, I'm sure you've heard this because there's quite a bit of media attention on this, with their quarterly returns, right? Because they have to report to their shareholders. So really worried much more about their share price than, say, about the long run growth of the company in terms of its ability to actually produce high quality, competitively priced goods and services that the world wants to buy. And so this data here by Bill Lazanik, who has a chapter in the book, is looking at, if you look at net income of companies up here, and then looking at the distribution of that income in two different ways: dividends, so the payouts to shareholders, and repurchases, so just buying back your own shares. The distribution between those two, which are two kind of proxies for financialization in terms of what you actually do with the income that you generate, is extremely high as a percentage of net income. In some companies like Microsoft, it's actually been over 100%. But these are some of the top share buybackers. And this number actually, if you take the last decade, so 2008, 2018, it's actually over 3 trillion. So huge amounts of money just being spent on buying back your own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, surprise, surprise, executive pay. Why? Because executives are often paid mainly through stock options than just a salary. And so this is very much that corporate governance issue. And by the way, there's huge heterogeneity in this. It's not true that all companies do this. Many companies actually are looking at the long term. I don't know if you know the work of, if you know Paul Polman, the head of Unilever, he's been a big critic of this. Also Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, a big investment company, wrote a letter to 500 CEOs saying we have to rethink our purpose. This is kind of screwed up. We can't just be wasting all this money. We could be thinking about things that have much higher social impact instead of just worrying about our share price. But the static picture continues to be this. In fact, Apple, that makes many of the products you probably have in front of you. In fact, everyone, it seems. By the way, I just read a great article that says it's really bad to have a computer in front of you during class, but it's okay, keep it on. I'll make sure we put it on the reading list. Apple, under Steve Jobs, did hardly any buybacks. It invested most of the money back into the company. Not necessarily R&D, by the way. Apple has often used existing technology, but lots of investment in design. You might have read the great book on Steve Jobs and just how much he paid attention to calligraphy and simplicity, but that was kind of investing back into thinking about how to produce great products. And under Tim Cook, actually, has undergone a massive buyback scheme, over 100 billion. Anyway, so one of the effects of this, of course, is that there's less money being invested back into the economy. So you have this irony that whereas profits are very high, as I mentioned, the profit share of income worldwide of GDP is at near record levels, and yet investment isn't. So if profits were being reinvested back into the economy, so into training of workers, to research and development, new machinery, new factories, then investment would be high. If profits are in fact being used for these more financialized purposes, this is one of the reasons why we see investment falling. We also see the percentage of cash flows returned to shareholders, as I mentioned, rising, and this has affected, of course, as I said, the profit labor share, which you can see also in terms of CEO to worker compensation ratio in the US. And unfortunately, this is, except in some countries, also seeming to rise as well. This isn't just a US problem. Many countries have followed, if you want the Anglo-Saxon model. And as I mentioned, business investment as a percentage of GDP. So sorry for all these graphs. I'm just trying to show you the same thing in different ways. And that last massive problem of, yep, that's fine. That's cool. That I mentioned at the beginning, those big 5 problems, climate change, huge, right? And so is this just about tinkering with carbon taxes? Well, carbon taxes would be very useful, but what it actually also means is a major shift in how we produce, how we distribute, how we consume. And some countries are actually taking action. China, by the way, due to the urgency, massive urgency they face with pollution, is taking action. They, maybe not enough, maybe not the right way, but just in terms of the numbers, over $1.7 trillion are being spent in China to really green, render more sustainable their entire manufacturing base. Denmark, a small, tiny country. Anyone here Danish? No? Okay. Is actually, has had a very ambitious green strategy over the years. And what's been interesting in Denmark is that they have especially fueled the service side of the green economy. So they not only have companies like Vestas, very active in wind and solar, but because kind of a green city strategy in Copenhagen also required lots of services, China today is actually the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China. So a little tiny country like Denmark is servicing a 1.7 trillion budget to green an economy. You know, how cool is that in terms of actually fueling, not just, you know, great sort of charitable giving, but profits. These are green companies producing green services that are able to see China's growth and China's transition as an opportunity. But the IPCC report, which I really encourage you all at least to read the executive summary, the big in climate change report that just came out last month, but also the IEA has different statistics on the on this problem and basically argues that we're currently only spending about 20% of what would be required even just within renewable energy. And so again, the point of the chapter was, are we actually going to get a change in the system just by putting bandages here and there, or do we have to really rethink how public, how private, and how third sector institutions work together? And in the last 7 minutes, what I wanted to do is just to give you an inkling of, you know, why this is important in terms of some of the big structural shifts that we've seen in, you know, capitalism in the last 100 years, because one of the defining aspects of capitalism has actually been innovation, technological, organizational, social innovation, again, compared to the kind of 500 years of inertia in feudalism that preceded it. And so if we can't understand that big change that occurred, just think of you know, the big mass production revolution, the big changes that we've had in space and aviation and automobiles and IT, the internet and different forms of energy, both the dirty energy and the clean energy, then we're going to have a hard time dreaming up a sort of future in, ahead of us. And so this is more from the work that I wrote in chapter 6 of the book, which I'm not going to be presenting, so this is sort of a hint of some of the stuff that's there. And basically what I argue is that if we can't use the current toolkit to understand what got us this stuff, which was fundamental in some of the biggest advances that capitalism has had in terms of growth, so new technology, R&D, but not just R&D, different types of inputs for innovation being one of the key drivers of long-term growth. If we can't understand how this came about, it's going to be really hard to understand the future of the system. And it would be very hard to understand how to get these great 17 goals that I mentioned in the beginning. By the way, beneath these 17 goals are 169 targets. And you know, the fact that so many countries, over 150 countries, have signed up to them is really, really, again, important and interesting. But if economies then can't structure themselves, literally in terms of how we collaborate, how we organize companies and businesses and international organizations to address these goals, and then it's just blah, blah, blah. It just makes us feel good, right? And so what chapter 6 does is it kind of breaks down our understanding of innovation, which was a really important concept, interestingly, both in Karl Marx, who wrote a lot about capitalism, and Joseph Schumpeter, one of the biggest theorists about innovation, and just kind of asks, what do we know about the role of public and private? And this is a graph I often show when I talk about innovation, because it kind of dispels this myth that somehow all you need is a lot of science here, and then somehow naturally this stuff turns into great new products at the end. What actually was required, and again, chapter 6 kind of goes through this in more detail, is different types of organizations, both in business, and these are the famous organizations, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, et cetera, but also in the public sector, to be distributed across that whole chain. And why this is important is that the market failure theory would kind of make you think that you just need a lot of investment here by governments to fund that basic research, and then somehow finance and companies will take care of the rest. Whereas these acronyms in red here are just different types. Don't worry about exactly what they are and what they mean. You will not be tested on that. But the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which in this country they copied to be SBRI, InQtel, the venture capital fund of the CIA, be careful, the National Institutes of Health, ARPA-E, Yozma, Public Venture Capital Fund in Israel. These are all examples of different public organizations that actually invested, taking on big risks across the whole chain in basic research, in applied research, in early stage financing of companies that wanted to innovate, because companies require patient finance, not inpatient finance. If you've heard of the word venture capital, venture capitalists are there in the private sector, in the private financial sector, to provide finance to those small companies that want to innovate in places like Silicon Valley. But the problem is they then want that investment to exit in 3 or 5 years. In other words, to be bought up by another company or to be issued on the stock market, an IPO. And 3 to 5 years doesn't get you enough time for some of the biggest kind of changes to occur in biotech and nanotech and internet and green tech. So this famous kind of phase here of Death Valley, it can last even 10 or 15 years. And what has actually been required in different countries is this patient, long-term, committed finance to occur from different types of public organizations. And it's precisely these organizations, whether it's the DARPA type of organization that funded the internet, the CIA, which funded your touchscreen display. Again, be careful every time you put your finger on your phone. But that actually it would be really interesting to understand how they work, how they do career structures, how they actually invested that money, because we often fall into these dichotomous kind of black and white ideas of austerity, so less public money, or invest, more public money, without really understanding that what matters, just like in the private sector, in the public sector, what matters is the organizational capacity of those organizations that are making these fundamental investments. So one of the things we do in IIPP, the institute that I direct and which is putting forth this course, is trying to understand globally what actually happens, for example, in a public bank like the KfW, which is a public bank in Germany, when it's lending to companies in Germany in order to foster the green transition, which in Germany they call the Energiewende. How do they do that? How can they know where to invest? How can they make sure they're not just picking winners and actually invest in a broad portfolio of different types of green companies, but also really push through that directional agenda at the same time? So this, again, was just kind of the point that I made before about everything in your iPhone was funded by some state agency, so internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. The book Entrepreneurial State kind of unpicks that. But the real point is that it's not just science, it's also, as I mentioned, this patient finance through procurement policy. It's different types of health budgets, which in the US, the National Institutes of Health were actually responsible for 75% of new molecular entities with priority rating. So these really revolutionary new drugs that have been out there, blockbuster drugs, we don't really understand necessarily how important that is. And if we did, we might start asking much more difficult questions about the prices of these medicines, right? How can it be that you have over $30 billion in the US funding the drugs, and then the prices of these drugs being astronomical, that you actually need the taxpayer to come in again and subsidize it, say, through the welfare state? Or in this country, for example, there's an organization called NICE, N-I-C-E, which gets the prices down, but it's not a very efficient system. If you are going to have in energy and health in different areas such a large amount of public funds, we should also think about a market-shaping, market co-creating lens, and how to think about the access to those products, which have in fact been co-created by business, yes, but also by different actors like the public sector. I think I have 30 seconds left, so I'm not going to say much more, except, let me see. Just to say that one of the things that we really are trying to do, both in the Institute, but very much in this course, is to abandon ideology. Let's really think, not so much from scratch, there's lots of tools we should be using, but this wonderful quote here by Bill Gates is basically saying, the only way we got the IT revolution was actually having different types of public actors leading, and then myself and Steve Jobs kind of followed suit. We don't necessarily have that today in the green economy. And that kind of idea that the most ambitious and interesting things that have happened in the private sector have not happened in a vacuum. They have happened within a system, identifying aspects of that system, both microeconomically, so inside the firm, how it was organized. Again, the class of Bill Izanik will be looking a lot at that, but also the system around it, which would include the direction of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy itself isn't just about counter-cyclical stimulus. It can also, again, engender all sorts of big transformations as we had after World War II. There's a great documentary, by the way, out on Netflix on Roosevelt. I suggest you all look at that in terms of understanding some of the dynamics behind the New Deal. But yeah, just kind of abandoning ideology about what we think firms are for, governments are for, the different types of organizations within government, and really think through how we could, organize the economic system in such a way that both benefited from our understanding of how it works in terms of the dynamics, as I mentioned before, a system that actually has been subject to constant disequilibria, where then in order to bring more stability, certain things had to happen, but that stability isn't enough. To have transitions, for example, a green transition, a sustainable transition, certain things have to be in place, and we can learn a lot from what happened in the past, both in terms of positive and negative.